The chalky cliffs of Dover were a smear of ghostly white against a leaden sky. To Elodie de Chambord, they were not a welcome sight, but a stark, unforgiving barrier between the France of her memory, all sun-drenched lavender fields and the gilded halls of her father's chateau, and the grim reality of her exile. The Channel had been a churning, vomit-stained gauntlet, and now England offered a cold, damp embrace. She stood on the heaving deck of the packet ship, her fingers, encased in worn kid leather, gripping the salt-crusted railing. The fine wool of her dress, once a deep sapphire blue, was now faded and travel-stained. It was the very last of her fine garments, carefully selected for its lack of ostentation and its durability. Everything else, the silks, the satins, the jewels, were at the bottom of the sea, or sold for a pittance to fund this desperate flight. Mademoiselle Thorne? A voice rasped beside her. Elodie started, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She turned to see a grizzled old sailor, his face a roadmap of wrinkles carved by wind and salt spray. "Yes," she said, forcing her voice into a lower, more modulated register. "I am Miss Eleanor Thorne." The name felt like a ill-fitting shoe, pinching with every syllable. "We're making ready to dock. Have your papers ready for the customs men." She nodded, her throat tight. The papers. A forged letter of introduction, a fabricated history from a respectable but fictitious family in Sussex, and a heart full of terror. The reign of terror had taken her father to the guillotine, her mother to a fever-ridden prison cell, and had sent Elodie, the sole survivor, fleeing into the night with only her wits and her fluent, perfectly accented English, a gift from a childhood governess her mother had deemed an unnecessary extravagance. Now that extravagance was her only currency. The journey to London was a blur of soot-blackened brick and a cacophony of street cries. From London, a bone-jarring coach ride brought her to the wilds of Northumberland, to the edge of the Cheviot Hills. And there, standing like a brooding sentinel against the bruised twilight sky, was Blackwood Hall. It was not a home, it was a fortress of dark grey stone, its windows like suspicious eyes, its turrets spearing the low-hanging clouds. The air was thin and cold, carrying the scent of pine and damp earth. As the coach rattled away, leaving her alone before the massive oak door, Elodie felt a chill that had nothing to do with the northern climate. The door was opened not by a cheerful housekeeper, but by a tall, grim-faced man with shoulders that seemed to fill the entire frame. He was perhaps in his late 30s, with hair the color of dark walnut and eyes of a piercing, unnerving gray. They were the eyes of a man who had seen too much and trusted too little. He did not speak, merely stepped aside to allow her entry. "I am Miss Thorne," Elodie said, her voice echoing in the cavernous stone-flagged entrance hall. "I am expected by Mr. Alistair Blackwood." "I am Blackwood," the man said. His voice was a low baritone devoid of warmth. It was the voice of command. "Follow me." He led her not to a drawing room, but to a study that was the physical manifestation of the man himself, severe, ordered, and functional. A large oak desk dominated the room, its surface bare save for a single brass lamp and a stack of papers. Books lined the walls, their spines uniform and serious. There was no fire in the grate, and the room was bitterly cold. "Your references," he said without offering her a seat. Elodie's hand trembled slightly as she withdrew the folded papers from her reticule. He took them, his long, strong fingers brushing against hers. A jolt, like a spark of static, passed between them. His eyes flickered up to hers, so quickly she might have imagined it, but the intensity of his gaze made her feel utterly transparent. He did not merely read the letters, he dissected them. He held them up to the lamplight, his thumb tracing the seals, his eyes missing nothing. Minutes stretched into an eternity. Elodie stood, her back straight, her chin slightly raised, the way her mother had taught her to face adversity. Noblesse oblige. The irony was a bitter pill. "It says here you were educated at Mrs. Godfrey's Academy for Young Ladies in Sussex," he stated, finally lowering the papers. "Yes, sir. A respectable institution. I have a cousin in that county. Perhaps you know the family? The Hargreaves of Hargreaves Manor." Elodie's blood ran cold. It was a test. A trap. She had studied a map of Sussex, but family names were a minefield. She allowed a polite, slightly confused smile to touch her lips. "I am afraid not, sir. Mrs. Godfrey's was a very sheltered environment. We had little contact with the local gentry." Blackwood's expression did not change. He placed the papers on his desk. "You are here to educate my ward, Miss Lillian. She is 10 years old. She requires instruction in French, history, geography, and the pianoforte. You will find her spirited. Your duties begin at 7 tomorrow morning. Mrs. Hemsley, the housekeeper, will show you to your room. It was a dismissal. Abrupt and absolute. He had already turned his attention to the papers on his desk, his broad back a clear message. She was hired. She was also, it seemed, already an inconvenience. As she followed the kindly, if taciturn, Mrs. Hemsley up the grand staircase, Elodie felt a wave of exhaustion so profound it made her knees weak. She had passed the first hurdle. She was inside. She had a roof over her head and a position. But as she glanced back down the stairs towards the closed door of the study, she felt the weight of Alistair Blackwood's grey eyes upon her still. He had looked at her forged papers, but it was her he had been scrutinizing. And she had the unsettling, terrifying feeling that he had seen not Eleanor Thorne, the governess, but Elodie de Chambord, the fugitive. Lillian Blackwood was a creature of wind and wildness, with a tangle of black curls and eyes the color of a summer storm. She regarded Elodie with open suspicion from her perch on the window seat of the schoolroom. "You're the new one," she stated, not asked. "The last one cried when I put a frog in her knitting basket." "I am not overly fond of frogs," Elodie replied calmly, arranging the primers on the desk. "But I find tears are generally a waste of salt. Shall we begin with French? I understand it is a weakness." Lillian blinked, thrown off balance by the lack of reaction. "I don't see the point. I shall never go to France." "The point," Elodie said, her voice softening with a memory of Parisian boulevards and the scent of baking bread, "is that it teaches your mind to think in a different way. It is like learning a secret code. And who knows? The world is a strange place. You may have need of a secret code one day." The lesson that followed was a battle of wills, but Elodie, trained by masters of etiquette and diplomacy, was more than a match for a 10-year-old. She was patient, firm, and unexpectedly witty. By the end of the morning, Lillian had reluctantly conceded to learn a few verbs. Days bled into weeks. Elodie fell into the rhythm of the household. Her world became the schoolroom, her own small, Spartan bedroom, and the long, drafty corridors of Blackwood Hall. Alistair Blackwood was a ghost in his own home. She saw him at a distance, riding his great black stallion across the moors, or heard the firm tread of his boots on the floor below. He never joined them for meals, he took them in his study. He never inquired after Lillian's progress, at least not directly to Elodie. Yet she felt his presence constantly. It was in the way the servants straightened up when his shadow fell across a doorway. It was in the absolute silence that descended when he was near. And it was in the occasional, unsettling moments when she would look up from a book in the library and find him standing in the doorway, watching her, his expression unreadable. One afternoon, a month into her employment, she was in the music room, guiding Lillian's clumsy fingers through a simple sonatina. The child had no natural talent, but a surprising determination. "No, ma chère, like this," Elodie said, her own fingers dancing effortlessly over the keys, demonstrating the phrase. The music filled the room, a piece by Couperin, light and intricate. For a moment, she was back in the grand salon of the Château de Chambord, the afternoon light streaming through the tall windows, her mother smiling indulgently. She finished the phrase and looked up. Alistair Blackwood was standing in the doorway, perfectly still. How long had he been there? His gaze was not on Lillian but on Elodie's hands. Her long, slender, aristocratic fingers, which had never known a day of real labor. "You play very well for a graduate of Mrs. Godfrey's academy," he remarked, his tone flat. "The technique is exceptional." Elodie's heart stuttered. "I had a gifted music master, sir. And I practiced diligently. I am sure." His grey eyes met hers, and in their depths she saw not admiration but a cold, calculating assessment. "That piece is French, is it not? A favorite of the Ancien Regime, I understand." The air left her lungs. It was an accusation delicately wrapped. "It is simply beautiful music, Mr. Blackwood," she managed to say, her voice barely a whisper. He gave a curt nod. "Lillian, your posture is atrocious. See that Miss Thorne corrects it." He turned and was gone. Elodie stared at the empty doorway, her hands trembling in her lap. He knew. He had to know. He was piecing her together, fragment by carefully concealed fragment. That night, she lay in her narrow bed, listening to the wind howl around the hall like a banshee. She thought of the locket she kept hidden in a small slit in the lining of her portmanteau. Inside was a tiny, painted miniature of her parents. It was all she had left of them. It was all she had left of Elodie. The fear was a constant companion, a cold stone in her belly. But as she lay there, another feeling began to kindle alongside it, a spark of defiance. She would not be broken. She had survived the revolution. She would survive the scrutiny of Alistair Blackwood. The crisis came on a rain-lashed Tuesday. A messenger, soaked and shivering, arrived at Blackwood Hall with a dispatch. Elodie, coming down the stairs with an armful of books, saw Blackwood take the letter. He read it, his face, usually an impassive mask, tightening. He looked up, and his eyes immediately found hers on the staircase. "Miss Thorne. A word in my study." The cold stone in her belly turned to ice. This was it. He had received word from his cousin in Sussex. The forgeries had been discovered. She followed him, her legs moving as if through water. He closed the study door behind her with a soft, definitive click. He did not go to his desk but stood before the cold fireplace, the letter crumpled in his fist. "There has been an incident in London," he began, his voice dangerously quiet. "A French agent, a royalist sympathizer, was apprehended trying to bribe a clerk in the Home Office. Under vigorous interrogation he gave up a list of names. Aristocrats who fled France and are now hiding in England." Elodie's world tilted. She gripped the back of a leather chair to steady herself. She could not speak. She could only wait for the axe to fall. "The name de Chambord was on that list," Blackwood said, his gray eyes pinning her to the spot. "The daughter, Elodie. She is described as being young, beautiful, with hair the color of wheat and eyes of cornflower blue. Fluent in English. Believed to be attempting to secure a position as a governess or companion." He took a step towards her. "The description is remarkably accurate, would you not say, Mademoiselle de Chambord?" The name, her true name, spoken in his deep voice in this grim English study, was the most terrifying and the most beautiful sound she had ever heard. The carefully constructed facade of Eleanor Thorne shattered into 1,000 pieces. She was laid bare. Defenseless. Tears she had held back for months finally welled in her eyes. "Are you going to turn me in?" she whispered, her voice breaking. He studied her for a long, agonizing moment. He was not a handsome man, not in the classical sense. His features were too harsh, his jaw too stubborn. But in that moment he held the power of life and death over her, and he had never looked more compelling. "Why should I not?" he countered, his voice still low. "Harboring a fugitive is a serious crime. You have lied to me from the moment you set foot in this house." "I had no choice." The words burst from her, fueled by a year of terror and grief. "They killed my father. My mother died in that stinking prison. I watched my world burn, Mr. Blackwood. I'm not a spy. I'm not a threat. I just wanted to live." She saw a muscle twitch in his jaw. "I know." The two words hung in the air between them, simple and profound. "You know? I was not always a country gentleman, Miss Thorne. Or rather, Mademoiselle de Chambord. I served His Majesty's government for 15 years. In various capacities. I have a nose for lies. And you, my dear, are a terrible liar. You knew? All this time?" She was stunned, bewildered. "From the first moment you stepped into this hall. The way you carried yourself. The cadence of your speech, too refined for a provincial governess. Your hands. The way you picked up a teacup. 100 tiny details that screamed of a life of privilege you were desperately trying to conceal." "Then why?" she implored, confusion warring with a wild, fragile hope. "Why did you not expose me?" He looked away from her, towards the rain-streaked window. "Because I have also seen worlds burn. I have seen what men do to each other in the name of ideology. And I looked at you and I did not see a threat to the British crown. I saw a brave, foolish, desperately frightened girl fighting to survive." He turned back to her, his gaze direct and unsettlingly open. "And because Lillian has never responded to a governess as she has to you. You have been good for her." The relief was so immense it was a physical pain. She swayed on her feet. In an instant he was there, his hand on her arm, steadying her. His touch was firm, warm, sending a shock of heat through the thin fabric of her sleeve. It was the first time he had touched her with anything resembling gentleness. "The agent who provided the list is in custody. The information has been contained for now," he said, his voice closer now, a low murmur near her ear. "But you are not safe. Not truly. There are others who will be looking." "What am I to do?" she asked, her voice small. "You will continue to be Eleanor Thorne," he said firmly. "But now you will not have to do it alone." In the quiet of the study, with the rain hammering against the windows, a new understanding was forged between them. The hunter had chosen to become the protector. And the fugitive was no longer alone in her lie. The dynamic within Blackwood Hall shifted irrevocably. The air, once thick with unspoken suspicion, was now charged with a different, more potent tension, a fragile, burgeoning trust. Alistair no longer watched her from the shadows with cold scrutiny, but with a focused, protective intensity. He began to join them for dinner in the small, informal dining room. The first meal was an awkward affair. Lillian chattered obliviously, but Elodie could barely eat, her senses hyper-aware of the man sitting at the head of the table. He was a formidable presence, his silence more eloquent than other men's speeches. He asked Lillian about her lessons, his questions sharp and intelligent, and listened to her answers with a seriousness that made the child straighten with pride. Afterwards, as Mrs. Hemsley led a yawning Lillian to bed, Alistair gestured for Elodie to remain. "We must be practical," he said, pouring 2 small glasses of amber brandy. He pushed one towards her. "An aristocrat's drink. Another test, perhaps, or an acceptance." She took it, her fingers brushing his. This time the spark was not one of fear but of something else entirely. "The threat is real but contained for the moment," he continued, his gaze fixed on the liquid in his glass. "However, my former colleagues may still make inquiries. Your story must be flawless. We will build you a past, a real one, with details that can withstand investigation." And so, in the evenings by the light of the study lamp, they constructed the life of Eleanor Thorne. He was a master of deception, teaching her the art of building a legend, the name of her fictional childhood sweetheart, the color of the door of her fictional home, the specific type of apple tree that grew in its garden. He drilled her until the fictional memories felt more real than her own fading recollections of Chambord. In turn, she found herself learning the man behind the ex-spy. He spoke of his time in the war-torn colonies of America, of shadowy meetings in Vienna, of the cost of a life built on secrets and lies. He did not speak of it with pride, but with a weary regret that tugged at something deep within her. One afternoon he found her in the library, attempting to mend a tear in Lillian's favorite pinafore. Her stitches were clumsy, hopeless. "Let me," he said, surprising her. He took the needle and fabric from her hands. His own hands, so large and capable, performed the task with an astonishing, precise delicacy. "A necessary skill in the field," he explained, a ghost of a smile touching his lips. "One cannot always rely on a tailor when hiding in a Lisbon attic." She laughed, a genuine, unburdened sound that seemed to startle them both. He looked up from his sewing, his gray eyes soft, and in that moment the stern ex-spy vanished and she saw only Alistair. The realization struck her with the force of a physical blow. She was falling in love with him. This grim, complicated, honorable man who had seen through all her lies and had chosen to stand by her side. It was a terrifying, impossible prospect. She was a fugitive with a price on her head, and he was her protector. Anything more was a fantasy. Yet the fantasy took root. It was in the way his gaze lingered on her when she played the pianoforte in the evenings, the music no longer a source of suspicion but a shared solace. It was in the casual brush of his shoulder against hers as they walked through the gardens, pointing out the first signs of spring to Lillian. It was in the unspoken language that passed between them across the dinner table, a world of understanding contained in a single glance. The external conflict had forged a bond, but it was this quiet, domestic intimacy that was weaving their souls together. The peace was shattered with the arrival of Sir James Whittaker. He was everything Alistair was not, polished, charming, with a ready smile and fashionable clothes that looked absurdly out of place in the rugged Northumberland landscape. He was, Alistair informed her tersely, a former associate from his days in the service. Whittaker's eyes, a little too keen, a little too assessing, lingered on Elodie from the moment he was introduced to the governess. Over a tense dinner, he dominated the conversation with witty, slightly malicious gossip from London. "And the talk of the ton, of course, is still these wretched French aristos crawling onto our shores," he said, sipping his wine. "Seems one of them, a real prize, the de Chambord girl, has given our men the slip. Pretty little thing by all accounts. Wouldn't be surprised if she's tucked away in some country house, turning the head of some unsuspecting squire." Elodie felt the food turn to ash in her mouth. She kept her eyes on her plate, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. "I find the topic distasteful, James," Alistair said, his voice like chilled steel. "Do you, Blackwood? I would have thought it right up your alley. A hunt. A puzzle. You were always the best of us." Whittaker's smile was sharp. "They say the girl has a particular mark, a small scar just above her left eyebrow. A childhood riding accident, I believe. Makes her rather easy to identify if one knows to look for it." Elodie's hand instinctively flew to the tiny, silvery scar, usually hidden by the wisps of her hair. She had told Alistair it was from a fall from a tree at Mrs. Godfrey's. The table fell into a deathly silence. Lillian, sensing the tension, looked between the adults with wide eyes. Alistair placed his napkin on the table with deliberate slowness. The hunt holds no interest for me anymore, James. My interests are here now. At Blackwood Hall. Later that night, Elodie, too agitated to sleep, paced the floor of her bedchamber. A soft knock came at her door. It was Alistair. He knows, she breathed as he entered, closing the door softly behind him. He suspects, Alistair corrected, his face grim in the moonlight filtering through the window. He is fishing. Whitaker was always a bloodhound. He caught the scent the moment he saw you. What are we to do? He will not act without proof. And he will not find any here. But his presence is a danger. He leaves tomorrow. We must simply endure until then. They stood close together in the dim room, the space between them humming with unspoken fear and something else, something hotter and more urgent. The scar, she whispered. I am sorry I lied. You had to, he said simply. He reached out, and with a touch so gentle it made her want to weep, he brushed her hair back from her forehead, his thumb tracing the faint silvery line. It is a part of you. A part of your story. His hand cupped her cheek, his thumb stroking her skin. His gaze was dark, intense, filled with a warring mixture of duty and desire. Elodie, he murmured, using her true name for the second time, but now it was a caress. It was her undoing. She rose on her toes and kissed him. It was not a gentle kiss. It was a conflagration. It was a year of fear and loneliness and grief, meeting a decade of isolation and hardened resolve. It was the crumbling of every barrier between them, protector and fugitive, aristocrat and spy, lies and truth. His arms wrapped around her, pulling her tightly against him, his body solid and real and safe. For the first time since her world had ended, Elodie de Chambord did not feel afraid. She felt found. Whitaker left the next morning, his departure as unceremonious as his arrival. But the damage was done. The fragile world they had built felt paper-thin, vulnerable to the slightest gust of wind from the outside world. Yet, within the walls of Blackwood Hall, something new and powerful had been born. Alistair and Elodie no longer hid from each other. Their love, acknowledged and reciprocated, became their secret fortress. They stole moments in the library, quiet walks on the moors, and whispered conversations in the firelit study after Lillian was asleep. He taught her how to defend herself, a few basic moves to break a hold, to create an opportunity to run. It was practical, but it was also symbolic. He was arming her not just for a potential threat but for life. He proposed to her one evening in the rose garden, the blooms heavy and perfumed in the twilight. It was not a flowery speech. It was a statement of fact. They will never stop looking for Elodie de Chambord, he said, holding both her hands in his. But they have no reason to look for Mrs. Alistair Blackwood. Marry me. Let me give you my name. Let me give you my protection, not as your employer, but as your husband. Tears of joy, clean and pure, streamed down her face. Yes, she said. 1,000 times yes. But the shadow of the past was long. A few weeks later, a letter arrived for Alistair. He read it, his face hardening into the mask of the ex-spy she had first met. It's Whitaker, he told her, crushing the letter in his fist. He hasn't given up. He's made formal inquiries in Sussex. He's digging. It's only a matter of time before he unearths the fact that there was no Eleanor Thorne at Mrs. Godfrey's academy. The hope that had begun to blossom in her chest withered. So this is it? We run. No, Alistair said, his voice resolute. We end this. I'm going to London. I still have friends, favors I can call in. I will bury the investigation so deep no one, not even Whitaker, will be able to find it. The thought of him leaving, of facing the long empty days without his strength, terrified her more than any French agent. But she saw the determination in his eyes. This was his battle to fight for her. For them. The day he left, he held her tightly at the door. Trust no one, he whispered into her hair. I will be back as soon as I can. She stood at the same window where she had first seen Lillian, watching his figure grow smaller and smaller until he was swallowed by the landscape. The hall felt immense and empty without him. The fear, her old companion, crept back in. Days turned into a week, then two. The silence was deafening. She and Lillian clung to each other, the child sensing Elodie's anxiety. Then one evening a single rider approached the hall. It was not Alistair. It was Sir James Whitaker. He stood in the entrance hall, his smile oily and triumphant. Miss Thorne. Or should I say Mademoiselle de Chambord? My sources have confirmed it. The real Eleanor Thorne died of scarlet fever at the age of 12. You are an impostor. A French fugitive living under the protection of a man who has betrayed his country to shield you. Elodie's blood ran cold. This was the confrontation she had dreaded. But as she looked at Whitaker's smug face, she felt not fear but a cold, clear rage. She would not cower. She would not run. "Mr. Blackwood has betrayed no one," she said, her voice steady, echoing in the great hall. "He has shown more honor and compassion than you could ever comprehend." "A pretty speech," Whitaker sneered. "It will sound very compelling at your trial. And at his." He took a step towards her. "You will come with me now." "She is going nowhere." The voice, cold and authoritative, came from the doorway. Alistair stood there, travel-stained and weary, but his eyes blazed with a ferocious light. In his hand he held a sealed document. "Blackwood." Whitaker spun around, his confidence faltering. "This is a matter of state security." "It is a matter of a personal vendetta, James," Alistair countered, walking slowly into the hall. He stopped beside Elodie, a solid, unshakable presence. "You were always jealous of my successes. You thought to find one here to ruin me. But you overplayed your hand." He held up the document. "This is an order, signed by the Home Secretary himself. All investigations into the whereabouts of one Elodie de Chambord are hereby terminated. Her presence in England is sanctioned on my recognizance. She is under my protection. Permanently." Whitaker's face fell, his triumph turning to ash. How did you?" "I told you," Alistair said, his voice dropping to a deadly whisper. "I have friends in high places. And you, James, have just made a very powerful enemy. I suggest you leave. No. And if I ever see you near my home or my fiancée again, the consequences will be dire." Defeated and seething, Whitaker turned on his heel and stalked out of Blackwood Hall, the sound of the slamming door a final, definitive end to the threat. Elodie turned to Alistair, her body trembling with relief. He pulled her into his arms, holding her as if he would never let go. "It is over," he murmured into her hair. "Truly over. You are free, Elodie. You are home." 1 year later. The ballroom of Blackwood Hall was filled with light and music. It was no longer a fortress, but a home, alive with laughter and conversation. At the center of it all stood Alistair and Elodie Blackwood, his hand resting possessively on the small of her back. She was no longer a fugitive, no longer a governess. She was his wife. The scar above her eyebrow was no longer a mark to be hidden, but a badge of her past, a part of the story that had led her here to this moment. Lillian, now a year older and considerably less wild, danced a careful quadrille with a visiting cousin, beaming with pride whenever she caught Elodie's eye. As the musicians struck up a waltz, Alistair led his wife onto the floor. He held her close, his gray eyes, once so cold and assessing, now soft with a love that still took her breath away. "Do you remember," he whispered as they moved together, "the first time you played the coupran? I looked at you and I saw a queen in exile, trying to pretend she was a commoner." She smiled, resting her head against his shoulder. "And I looked at you and saw my jailer. How wrong I was." "You saw the man I had to be," he corrected gently. "You helped me remember the man I wanted to be." They danced on, a single entity moving in perfect harmony. The French aristocrat and the English spy. The liar and the truth-seeker. Their love had been forged in the crucible of fear and suspicion, but it had been tempered by trust and had emerged, like a phoenix from the ashes of their old lives, unbreakable and strong. Outside, the Northumberland wind whispered around the hall, but inside there was only warmth and light, and the promise of a future finally without lies.